The light turned red just as his car rolled to a stop, and across the street, in the thin slice of late afternoon sunlight, stood a child who looked exactly like him. Ethan Cole didn't notice the honk behind him or the impatient flicker of the crosswalk timer counting down from 10 because everything in his world narrowed to that single frame. A small boy in a faded denim jacket, one sneaker slightly untied, standing beside a woman whose posture was too still to be accidental, her hand resting lightly on the child's shoulder as if anchoring him to the moment. The city moved around them in layers of noise, sirens in the distance, the hum of engines, voices rising and falling, but it all dulled into something distant, something irrelevant, as Ethan's grip tightened on the steering wheel. The boy shifted his weight, tilting his head just slightly, and that was when it hit him. Not just a resemblance, not just a passing coincidence, but something sharper, something undeniable. The shape of the jaw, the set of the eyes, even the way the child frowned, like he was already learning how to hold questions inside without asking them. Ethan's breath stalled, a quiet, involuntary pause that didn't belong to a man who controlled billion-dollar decisions before breakfast. He blinked once, then again, like the image might reset if he gave it a second, but it didn't. The light changed. Cars surged forward around him, horns flaring in irritation, but Ethan didn't move until someone shouted from the sidewalk and forced him back into motion. He pulled the car to the curb instead of crossing, the engine still running, his pulse louder now, syncing with something deeper than logic. Across the street, the woman hadn't moved. She hadn't even pretended not to see him. Amara Brooks stood exactly where she had been, her face calm in a way that didn't invite questions, her eyes locked on his like she had been expecting this exact moment, like time had simply caught up to something she had already accepted. Ethan opened the car door and stepped out, the city air hitting him sharper than it should have, carrying the scent of asphalt and coffee and something metallic beneath it all. He adjusted his coat out of habit, though nothing about this felt controlled anymore, and crossed the street without looking left or right, his focus pinned entirely on the space between them. The boy noticed him first. Small fingers tightened slightly around the fabric of Amara's sleeve, curiosity flickering across his face without fear, just a quiet awareness, as if he was used to watching the world carefully before deciding what it meant. Ethan slowed as he reached them, the last few steps heavier than the rest, like gravity had shifted just enough to remind him he wasn't in charge of this moment. Up close, the resemblance was no longer something he could question. It was exact in ways that didn't allow denial to exist. The boy's eyes lifted, studying him openly now, and Ethan felt something unfamiliar press against his chest, something that didn't fit into spreadsheets or negotiations or outcomes he could predict. Amara didn't speak. She didn't move. She simply watched him, her expression steady, unreadable, but not cold, just resolved. Ethan swallowed, his voice quieter than he intended when it finally came out. "Tell me the truth." The words hung between them, thinner than he expected, like they might break under their own weight. His gaze flicked once more to the child, then back to her. "Is he mine?" There was no rush in her answer. No hesitation either. Just a single breath, measured, controlled, as if she had rehearsed nothing and yet prepared for everything. Yes. The world didn't shatter. There was no dramatic shift, no sound cutting out or swelling music rising to meet the moment. Everything stayed exactly the same. The traffic, the voices, the distant siren. But inside Ethan, something realigned so quickly it almost felt like a loss of balance. He didn't step back, but something in his posture gave, just slightly, like a structure adjusting to a truth it hadn't accounted for. His eyes dropped again to the boy, to the undeniable proof standing right in front of him, and for a moment, he couldn't find the next thought to hold on to. How? The word came out incomplete, and he didn't finish it, because the answer was already forming in the space between them, in the silence Amara held like a boundary. She shifted her weight just enough to place herself a fraction closer to the child, not defensive, not protective in a dramatic way, just present. "You disappeared," she said, her voice even, grounded, without accusation but without softness either. "A month before I found out." Ethan's jaw tightened, a reflex he couldn't stop. "I didn't disappear," he said, but even as the words left him, they sounded thinner than they should have, like they belonged to a version of the past that didn't hold up under light. Amara's gaze didn't waver. "You left," she corrected, the distinction landing quietly but firmly. The boy looked between them, his small brow furrowing slightly, sensing the shift without understanding it, and Ethan noticed it, the awareness in him, the way he absorbed the tension instead of reacting to it. "What's his name?" Ethan asked, the question coming out softer now, less like a demand and more like something he wasn't sure he had the right to ask. "Noah," she said. The name settled into him heavier than expected, simple and grounded, like it had always belonged to that face. Ethan nodded once, almost unconsciously, his gaze lingering on the child, on Noah, like he was trying to memorize something he had missed without knowing it existed. "You should have told me," he said, and this time the words didn't carry authority, just a quiet attempt to reclaim something already gone. Amara's lips pressed together for a brief second, not in anger, not in hesitation, just in acknowledgement of the weight of what he'd said. "I thought about it," she admitted, her tone unchanged. "And then I decided he deserved more than being an option." The sentence didn't rise. It didn't cut. It simply landed, and somehow that made it sharper. Ethan exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible, as he absorbed it, as he felt the shape of it settle into a space he didn't have a defense for. Noah shifted again, glancing up at Amara before looking back at Ethan, his expression curious, open, unguarded in a way that made everything feel more real. "Are you someone we know?" Noah asked, his voice small but clear, the question simple in a way that stripped everything else down to its core. Ethan's throat tightened unexpectedly, the answer caught between what was true and what he had earned the right to say. He looked at Amara, searching for something, permission, maybe, or direction, but she didn't give either. She just watched him, steady, letting the moment belong to him now. Ethan crouched slightly, lowering himself to Noah's level, the movement unfamiliar, deliberate, as if he was stepping into something he had never practiced before. He paused, choosing carefully, aware for the first time that words carried weight he couldn't control. "I'm someone who's just meeting you." Noah nodded slowly, accepting the answer without pushing further, his attention shifting as a bus approached the curb behind them with a long, steady hiss of brakes. The doors opened, and Amara adjusted the strap of her bag with one hand, her other hand finding Noah's again with quiet certainty. She didn't rush. She didn't hesitate. She simply moved forward, guiding him toward the bus like this was just another moment in a life she had already built without him. Ethan stood as they stepped past him, the space between them widening by inches that felt heavier than distance should. "Amara," he said, not loudly, but enough to stop her for half a second. She turned her head slightly, not fully, just enough to acknowledge him without reopening anything. "This doesn't end here." The statement sounded more like a realization than a promise. She held his gaze for a brief moment, something unreadable passing through her eyes before settling back into that same quiet resolve. "It didn't start here either," she replied, and then she stepped onto the bus, Noah beside her, the doors closing with a soft mechanical finality that didn't feel final at all. Ethan stood on the sidewalk as the bus pulled away, its reflection stretching across the glass of the buildings around him, distorting and then disappearing as it merged into the flow of traffic. He didn't move. Not immediately. For the first time in years, there was nothing to fix, nothing to negotiate, nothing to control. Just a truth, standing in the middle of a city that didn't stop for anything, and a boy with his face who had just walked out of his life before he had even stepped into it. The bus disappeared into the stream of traffic, but Ethan Cole remained exactly where he stood, the echo of its brakes still lingering in his ears like something unfinished, something that refused to settle into silence. The city resumed around him in full volume now, engines roaring, footsteps rushing past, voices rising in fragments that meant nothing to him. Yet he did not move, because for the first time in years, there was no immediate decision to make, no call to take, no assistant waiting on the other end of a line. There was only a name, Noah, repeating in his mind with a weight he could not quantify, and a face that mirrored his own in ways that logic could not undo. He reached into his coat pocket, pulling out his phone with a motion so automatic it felt disconnected from thought, and stared at the screen for a moment before unlocking it, his reflection faintly visible against the glass, sharper now, more aware. The contact list opened, rows of names tied to power, influence, solutions, and outcomes, but none of them fit what he needed in this moment. None of them carried the answer to a question he had never planned to ask. His thumb hovered, then moved, selecting a name he rarely hesitated to call. Marcus, he said when the line connected, his voice even, controlled, but quieter than usual. There was a brief pause on the other end, then the familiar professional tone. Yes, sir. Ethan looked up, scanning the street where the bus had disappeared, as if he could still trace its path by instinct alone. I need an address, he said. Another pause, shorter this time. Of course. Who am I looking for? Ethan exhaled once, steady, grounding himself in the structure of the request. Amara Brooks. The name settled into the conversation like something new, something that did not belong to his usual world of contracts and acquisitions. Marcus did not respond immediately this time, and Ethan could almost hear the shift in his assistant's posture, the recalibration that came with anything outside the expected. I will start now, Marcus said carefully. Ethan ended the call without another word, sliding the phone back into his pocket as his gaze drifted across the moving city again. But everything looked slightly different now, as if the scale had shifted and he was no longer standing at the center of it. Minutes passed before he returned to his car, the interior suddenly feeling smaller than it had earlier, the leather colder, the silence heavier. He started the engine but did not drive immediately, his hands resting on the wheel as his mind replayed the moment on the sidewalk, every detail sharper with each repetition. The way Noah had looked at him, not with recognition, not with expectation, just curiosity, open and unguarded. The way Amara had stood, not defensive, not emotional, simply certain, as if she had already built a life that did not require anything from him. Ethan leaned back slightly, his head resting against the seat, his eyes closing for a brief second, not to escape the moment, but to understand it. He had spent years mastering control, anticipating outcomes, structuring conversations before they began, but there had been no preparation for this, no strategy that accounted for a child who carried his face without his presence. When his phone vibrated again, the sound cut clean through the quiet. He answered immediately. I have something, Marcus said, his tone measured but efficient. Address, current residence, and limited background. She has been living in the same neighborhood for the past 3 years. No major financial ties, no legal flags, no public records beyond standard employment history. Ethan opened his eyes, sitting upright now, the shift in his posture subtle but decisive. Send it, he said. A moment later, the information appeared on his screen, an address in a part of the city he rarely entered, not because it was unfamiliar, but because it did not intersect with the world he operated in. He stared at it for a second longer than necessary, then placed the phone down and pulled into traffic, merging with the flow in a way that felt almost symbolic, as if he was stepping into something he had once left behind without realizing it would matter. The drive took 20 minutes, but it felt longer, not because of distance, but because every passing block seemed to strip away another layer of certainty he had carried for years. The buildings shifted from glass towers to brick facades, from polished entrances to narrow sidewalks lined with small businesses and faded signs, each one holding a different rhythm of life, one that did not pause for headlines or quarterly reports. Ethan parked a block away from the address, turning off the engine and sitting there for a moment, the quiet returning in a different form now, heavier with intention. He stepped out of the car, adjusting his coat again, not out of habit this time, but as if grounding himself before crossing a line he could not uncross. The building stood modestly at the corner, 3 stories high, with a narrow staircase leading up to a row of doors, each marked with small, simple numbers. There was no security desk, no reception, no barrier between. Inside and outside, just a space that existed without needing permission. Ethan approached slowly, each step measured, his gaze scanning the details without fully focusing on any of them until he reached the door marked with her number. He stopped there, his hand hovering just short of the wood, the distance between intention and action suddenly more significant than he expected. He had walked into boardrooms with less hesitation, made decisions that affected thousands without pause. But this felt different, because this was not about control or outcome. It was about presence, and presence required something he had not practiced in years. Before he could knock, the door opened. Amara stood there, her expression unchanged from earlier, calm, steady, but this time there was something else beneath it, something quieter, something that acknowledged his arrival without welcoming it. "You found it," she said, not surprised, not impressed, just stating what was already obvious. Ethan lowered his hand slowly, meeting her gaze. "I needed to talk," he replied, his voice even. But there was a weight behind it now, something less certain, more real. She stepped back just enough to leave the doorway open, not an invitation, not a rejection, simply space. He stepped inside, the apartment small but warm, the kind of space shaped by living rather than design. A couch near the window, a small table with a few scattered books, a backpack resting against the wall, and on the floor, a set of toy cars lined up with quiet precision. Noah sat near them, focused, his attention on arranging the cars in a pattern that made sense to him, his movements deliberate, calm. He looked up as Ethan entered, recognition flickering in his eyes now, not of who Ethan was, but of the moment they had shared earlier. Ethan paused, taking in the scene, the simplicity of it, the completeness of a life that had been built without him, and for the first time, the realization did not come with resistance, it came with something closer to understanding. Amara closed the door behind him, the soft click marking the shift from outside to inside, from distance to proximity. "Say what you came to say," she said, her tone steady, not rushed, not impatient, just clear. Ethan glanced once more at Noah, then back at her, the words forming slowly this time, chosen with care instead of certainty. "I did not know," he said. She nodded once, acknowledging the statement without reacting to it. "I believe that," she replied. There was no comfort in her voice, no accusation either, just truth, placed exactly where it belonged. Ethan inhaled quietly, then exhaled, the next sentence heavier than the first. "But I am here now." The words hung in the space between them, not as a solution, not as a demand, but as something that still needed to be tested. Amara held his gaze for a moment longer, then shifted slightly, her attention moving briefly to Noah before returning to Ethan. "Being here is not the same as belonging here," she said, her voice calm, grounded, leaving no room for misinterpretation. The sentence did not close the door, but it did define the threshold, and Ethan understood that immediately, not as a challenge to overcome, but as a truth he would have to learn how to meet. The air inside the apartment felt still, not empty, but settled, like everything in it had found its place long before Ethan stepped through the door, and now his presence shifted that balance just enough to be noticed without disrupting it. He stood near the entrance for a moment longer than necessary, aware of the space he occupied, aware that nothing in the room had been built with him in mind. Noah returned his attention to the small line of cars on the floor, adjusting one by a fraction of an inch, as if precision mattered, as if order gave him something steady to hold on to. Ethan watched him, the quiet concentration, the absence of distraction, and something about it felt familiar in a way that was not learned but inherent. "He likes things aligned," Amara said, her voice breaking the silence without tension, just information offered without explanation. Ethan nodded once, his gaze still on Noah. "So did I," he replied, the words leaving him before he could filter them, not as a comparison, not as a claim, just a realization forming in real time. Amara did not respond to that. She moved toward the small kitchen area, pouring a glass of water with slow, deliberate movements, not as an act of hospitality, but as a continuation of her routine, as if his presence did not require her to change anything about how she existed in her own space. Ethan took a step forward, then another, stopping a few feet away from where Noah sat. He did not crouch this time, did not lower himself into the moment yet, as if he understood that proximity was something to be earned, not assumed. "How old are you?" he asked, his tone careful, steady, the question simple but carrying more weight than it should have. Noah looked up again, studying him briefly before answering. "5," he said, holding up his hand with all 5 fingers extended, as if to confirm it physically. Ethan's chest tightened in a way he did not expect, the numbers settling into him as more than time, as years he had not witnessed, moments he had not been part of, days that had passed without his awareness. "5," Ethan repeated quietly, Not as a question, not as disbelief, just as acknowledgement. Noah nodded once, satisfied, then returned to his cars, pushing one forward along an invisible path on the floor. Ethan shifted his gaze to Amara again, the unspoken question already forming before he spoke it. "You have been doing this alone," he said, not asking, not assuming, just stating what was already clear. She set the glass down on the counter, her fingers resting lightly against it for a second before she turned back to face him. "Yes," she said simply. There was no pride in the word, no resentment either, just truth, grounded and complete. Ethan exhaled slowly, processing that, not as something to fix, but as something to understand. "You should not have had to," he said, the sentence coming out softer than anything he had said since walking in. Amara's expression did not change, but something in her eyes sharpened slightly, not with anger, but with clarity. "And yet I did," she replied, the words landing with quiet finality. Noah glanced up briefly at the shift in tone, then back down, his world still contained within the small arrangement in front of him, untouched by the layers unfolding around him. Ethan moved closer this time, lowering himself slowly to one knee, bringing himself to Noah's level, not as a gesture, but as a choice to meet him where he was. "Can I see?" he asked, nodding toward the cars, his voice careful, respectful of the small world Noah had built on the floor. Noah hesitated for a fraction of a second, then nodded, sliding one of the cars slightly toward Ethan, an unspoken permission that felt more significant than any verbal agreement. Ethan picked it up gently, turning it in his hand, noticing the small scratches along the side, the worn edges that spoke of use, of time, of care that came from repetition rather than replacement. "This one is fast," Noah said, his voice quiet but certain, pointing to another car in the line. Ethan followed the gesture, placing the one in his hand back exactly where he had found it before reaching for the one Noah indicated. "Fast how?" he asked, not testing, not leading, just inviting. Noah's eyes lit slightly, not with excitement, but with engagement, the kind that came from being taken seriously. "It wins," he said simply, as if that explained everything. Ethan nodded once, understanding more from the tone than the words themselves. "Then it has to stay in front," he said, placing it carefully at the head of the line, aligning it with the others with the same precision Noah had shown. Noah watched him do it, then gave a small nod, approval without ceremony. Amara observed from a distance, her arms loosely folded, her posture relaxed but attentive, not intervening, not encouraging, just allowing the moment to exist on its own terms. Ethan remained there for a few seconds longer, his attention on the small arrangement, on the quiet rhythm of Noah's movements, on the way the world seemed simpler from this level, more immediate, more real. He stood slowly, turning back to Amara, the shift in his expression subtle but present. "I am not here to disrupt this," he said, gesturing lightly toward the room, toward the life she had built. "I understand that this is his world." Amara met his gaze, her eyes steady, measuring not the words themselves, but the weight behind them. "And what are you here for?" she asked, the question direct, without edge, but without softness either. Ethan did not answer immediately this time. He looked back at Noah, at the small figure on the floor, then back at her, the silence stretching just long enough to hold the truth he was about to say. "To learn how to be part of it," he said finally, the words landing differently than anything he had said before, not as a claim, not as a right, but as something uncertain, something that acknowledged its own limits. Amara held his gaze for a moment longer, then nodded once, a small, controlled movement that did not grant acceptance, but did not deny the possibility either. "Then you start by understanding something," she said, her voice calm, unwavering. "He does not need you." The sentence settled into the room with quiet precision, not harsh, not defensive, just real. Ethan absorbed it without interruption, without correction, letting it land fully before responding. "I know," he said, and this time there was no hesitation, no resistance, just acknowledgement. Amara's expression softened by a fraction, not in warmth, but in recognition of the honesty in that response. "Good," she said, "because if you are here thinking you are going to fill something missing, you are already wrong." Ethan nodded once, the clarity of her words aligning with something he had begun to understand the moment he saw Noah on the sidewalk. I am not here to fill anything, he said quietly. I am here because I should have been here from the beginning. Noah looked up again at the sound of his voice, his eyes moving between them with quiet curiosity, sensing the shift without fully understanding it. And for a brief moment, the room held a different kind of stillness, one that was not about tension, but about possibility, fragile and undefined, waiting to be shaped not by words, but by what came next. The quiet in the room did not break after his words. It deepened, stretching into something that felt less like tension and more like a test, as if the space itself was waiting to see what he would do with what he had just said. Ethan did not move immediately, and that stillness, that restraint, was new even to him, because he was used to filling silence with action, with decisions, with something that pushed a moment forward. But here, pushing would mean losing ground. Noah rolled one of the cars forward again, the small wheels making a soft clicking sound against the floor, a simple rhythm that grounded the room in something real and present. Ethan watched it for a second, then shifted his attention back to Amara, his posture steady but no longer rigid. What does he like? He asked, the question careful, not broad, not invasive, just specific enough to show intention without assuming familiarity. Amara tilted her head slightly, studying him, not the question, but the reason behind it, and for a moment, the silence returned, not as resistance, but as evaluation. He likes patterns, she said finally, her voice calm, measured. Things that make sense. Things that do not change without reason. Ethan nodded slowly, absorbing that, recognizing something of himself in it, but not claiming it, not yet. And what does not make sense to him? He asked, the follow-up quieter, more deliberate. Amara's gaze did not waver. People who come and go, she said, the answer landing without emphasis, without emotion, but with a clarity that filled the space between them. Ethan did not respond right away, because there was nothing to correct in what she said, nothing to defend against, only something to understand. He glanced at Noah again, at the careful way he lined up the cars, the small adjustments he made to keep them straight, to keep them predictable, and for the first time, Ethan understood that this was not just play, it was structure, it was control in a world where control mattered. Then I will not come and go, Ethan said, his voice steady, not louder, not more forceful, just certain in a way that did not rely on authority. Amara did not soften at that, but she did not dismiss it either. She simply held his gaze for a moment longer, then gave a small nod, not acceptance, but acknowledgement. Consistency is not something you say, she replied. It is something you prove. Ethan inclined his head slightly, accepting that without argument, because it aligned with something he knew well in every other part of his life, but had never applied here. Then I will prove it, he said quietly. Noah looked up again, his attention drawn not by the words themselves, but by the shift in tone, the steadiness in Ethan's voice that carried something different now, something less sharp, more grounded. Are you staying? Noah asked, the question simple, direct, without layers, but it cut through everything else in the room because it was the only thing that mattered to him. Ethan's breath paused for a fraction of a second, not because he did not know the answer, but because he understood the weight of it now. He lowered himself again, not fully crouching this time, but enough to meet Noah's eyes without towering over him. Not today, he said, choosing honesty over comfort. But I will come back. Noah studied him for a second, his small face serious, evaluating in a way that felt older than his years. Tomorrow, he asked. Ethan glanced at Amara instinctively, not for permission, but for alignment, and she met his look without speaking, her expression neutral but attentive. Ethan looked back at Noah. Yes, he said. Tomorrow. Noah nodded once, as if that settled it, then returned to his cars, the moment filed away in his mind with the same precision he used to line them up. Ethan stood again, the shift in his posture subtle but present, less like a man arriving and more like someone learning how to stay without occupying too much space. He reached into his coat pocket, then stopped himself, the reflex to offer something, to provide, to fix, rising and then falling just as quickly as he recognized it for what it was. Instead, he let his hand drop back to his side, choosing presence over gesture. Amara noticed that, the small interruption of instinct, and something in her expression shifted, not visibly, not in a way most would catch, but enough to register. Good, she said quietly, more to the choice than the action itself. Ethan met her gaze, understanding what she meant without needing clarification. "I am learning," he replied, not as an excuse, but as a statement of where he stood. Amara nodded once, then moved toward the door, opening it with the same calm control she carried in everything she did. "Then start there," she said. Ethan walked toward the doorway, pausing for a brief second as he passed Noah, his eyes lingering on the small figure on the floor, on the life that had grown without him, not in resentment, but in quiet recognition. "I will see you tomorrow," he said, his voice steady, directed at Noah, but carrying something deeper beneath it. Noah looked up, gave a small nod, and returned to his cars, the rhythm of the wheels resuming without interruption. Ethan stepped out into the hallway, the air outside cooler, sharper, but not as overwhelming as before. The door closed behind him with a soft click, not final, not distant, just a boundary he now understood he would have to cross carefully, consistently, without force. He stood there for a moment, letting the quiet settle, then walked down the narrow staircase, each step measured, not rushed, not delayed, just intentional. Outside, the city moved the same way it always had, loud, fast, indifferent, but Ethan did not feel pulled by it in the same way anymore. He reached his car, paused with his hand on the door, and looked back once at the building, not searching for anything, just acknowledging where he had been. Then he got in, started the engine, and pulled away, not toward the skyline he knew so well, but towards something less defined, something that did not offer immediate results, but required something else entirely. The next morning came quieter than usual, the light filtering through his apartment windows softer, less sharp, and for the first time in years, Ethan did not reach for his phone the moment he woke. He sat there for a second, the memory of Noah's question still clear, still present, and he knew exactly where he needed to be. When he arrived at the building again, the street looked the same worn edges, the same rhythm of people moving through their day, but to him, it felt different, because now it held something personal, something that did not belong to anyone else. He walked up the steps, stopped at the door, and knocked, not with authority, not with impatience, just once, steady and clear. A moment passed, then the door opened, and Noah stood there this time, his small hand on the handle, his eyes lifting to meet Ethan's with recognition that was no longer just curiosity. "You came back," Noah said, not surprised, but confirming something he had been waiting to see. Ethan nodded once, his expression calm, grounded. "I said I would," he replied, and this time, the words did not feel like a promise. They felt like the beginning of something that would have to be built one day at a time. The door opened wider this time, not by much, but enough to signal a shift that did not need to be announced, and Noah stepped back without being asked, his small hand still resting on the edge of the door, as if marking the boundary he was now allowing Ethan to cross again. Ethan noticed it immediately, not the movement itself, but the difference in it, the absence of hesitation, and he stepped inside with the same measured pace as before, careful not to fill the space too quickly. The apartment looked the same, every detail in its place, the quiet order unchanged, but something in the atmosphere felt slightly different, not warmer, not yet, but more aware, as if the room itself had registered his return. "You said tomorrow," Noah said, closing the door behind him with a soft click, his voice calm, not excited, not questioning, just confirming something that had been tested and now recorded. Ethan nodded once, meeting his eyes directly. "I said tomorrow," he repeated, his tone steady, grounded in the simplicity of the promise kept. Noah studied him for a second longer, then turned and walked back to the floor where his cars were already arranged, as if he had resumed his place before Ethan even arrived. Ethan followed a few steps behind, stopping at the same distance as before, not closer, not farther, respecting a line that had not been drawn but was clearly understood. They stayed in line, Noah said, pointing to the cars, his voice carrying a quiet satisfaction. Ethan looked down, noticing the precision, the alignment unchanged from the day before, and he nodded. "You kept them that way," he said. Noah shook his head slightly. "They stay that way if nothing moves them," he replied, the statement simple, but layered with something that settled deeper than it appeared. Ethan absorbed that without responding immediately, recognizing the meaning behind it, the need for stability, for consistency, for things that did not shift without reason. Then I will not move them, Ethan said quietly, not as a metaphor, not directly, but enough that the meaning carried through. Noah glanced up at him again, not fully understanding the layers, but recognizing the tone, the steadiness, and he gave a small nod before returning to his cars. From the kitchen, the sound of a cabinet closing drew Ethan's attention, and he looked up to see Amara standing there, watching, her expression unchanged but her presence fully engaged. "You are early," she said, her voice calm, observational. Ethan checked his watch briefly, then looked back at her. "I wanted to be on time," he replied. Amara tilted her head slightly, considering that, then nodded once. "You are," she said, and though the words were simple, they carried a weight that suggested something more than punctuality. Ethan stepped closer, not toward her directly, but into the space where conversation could exist without distance. "What does his day look like?" he asked, his tone measured, intentional, not assuming involvement, but asking for understanding. Amara leaned lightly against the counter, her arms relaxed, her posture grounded. "School in an hour," she said. "He likes to walk. It takes 12 minutes if he stops twice, 10 if he does not." Ethan nodded, taking that in, the specificity, the routine, the structure that defined Noah's world. "Then I will walk with him," he said, not as a declaration, but as a possibility. Amara held his gaze, not immediately responding, and the silence stretched just enough to test the intention behind the words. "You can walk with us," she said finally, the distinction subtle but deliberate, placing him within the existing structure, not above it. Ethan inclined his head slightly. "With you," he agreed. Noah stood up then, brushing his hands lightly against his jeans, his attention shifting as if he had been listening even while focused on something else. "I do not like being late," he said, his tone matter of fact, not anxious, just clear. Ethan glanced at the clock on the wall, then back at Noah. "Then we will not be late," he said, matching the certainty in the child's voice without overpromising. Amara reached for Noah's jacket, handing it to him, then picked up her own, the movements efficient, practiced, part of a rhythm that had been repeated many times. Ethan did not reach to help, did not step in. He simply observed, learning the cadence of their routine before trying to fit into it. When they stepped outside, the morning air was crisp, the kind that carried a quiet clarity, and the street was already alive with movement, people heading in different directions, each with their own pace. Noah walked between them, not holding either of their hands, his steps small but steady, his attention moving between the sidewalk and the path ahead. Ethan adjusted his pace instinctively, slowing just enough to match Noah's stride, not leading, not lagging, just aligning. "You stopped twice," Ethan said after a few steps, recalling Amara's words. Noah nodded. Once there, he pointed ahead to a small crack in the sidewalk where a thin line of ants moved in a careful path, and once at the corner. Ethan followed the gesture, noticing the detail, the pattern, the way Noah's world included things most people would overlook. They reached the first stop, and Noah crouched slightly, watching the ants with quiet focus, counting under his breath, his voice low, rhythmic. Ethan stood beside him, not speaking, not interrupting, just observing, allowing the moment to exist without pressure. Amara watched from a step behind, her gaze shifting between them, measuring not the action, but the presence, the way Ethan did not rush, did not redirect, did not impose. After a few seconds, Noah stood again, satisfied, and continued walking without needing to be told. At the corner, he paused again, this time looking both ways, his posture straight, his attention sharp, waiting for the signal to change. Ethan glanced at the light, then back at Noah, noticing the patience, the discipline in such a small action. "You wait until it changes," Ethan said, more as acknowledgement than instruction. Noah nodded. "You have to," he replied, as if there was no other option. The light shifted, and they crossed together, the movement simple, but for Ethan, it carried a weight that felt unfamiliar, not because of the action itself, but because of what it represented, a shared step, a moment that existed without negotiation or strategy. When they reached the school, a low building with a fenced playground and the sound of children already filling the air, Noah stopped just before the entrance, turning slightly toward Amara. She knelt briefly, adjusting his jacket, smoothing a small wrinkle that only she seemed to notice, then met his eyes. "Have a good day," she said softly. Noah nodded once, then looked at Ethan, his expression thoughtful. "You were coming back later?" he asked. Ethan met his gaze, steady, without hesitation. "Yes," he said. Noah held his eyes for a second longer, then gave a small nod, accepting the answer, and turned toward the door, walking inside without looking back. Ethan watched him go, the moment stretching just long enough to settle into something real, something that did not need to be defined to be understood. Beside him, Amara stood, her posture relaxed but attentive, her gaze still on the door. "He asked you," she said quietly. Not a question, not a statement of surprise, just an observation. Ethan nodded. "He did," he replied. Amara turned to look at him then, her eyes steady, searching not for reassurance, but for consistency. "Then be here," she said, the words. Simple, but carrying the same quiet weight as everything else she had said. Ethan met her gaze, the city moving around them, the noise rising and falling in the background, but none of it pulling his focus away. "I will be," he said, and this time, the promise did not feel like something he was making for her, or even for Noah. It felt like something he was committing to for himself, a line he would not step away from. The school doors closed behind Noah, and for a moment, the noise of children's voices and footsteps lingered in the air like an echo before fading into the steady rhythm of the morning, leaving Ethan and Amara standing side by side on the sidewalk with a silence that felt different from the ones before, less guarded, but not yet open. Ethan kept his gaze on the entrance a second longer than necessary, as if the act of watching Noah walk inside had anchored something in him that he was not ready to let go of. He did not look back. Ethan said quietly, not as a complaint, not as disappointment, just an observation he had not expected to matter as much as it did. Amara folded her arms lightly, her eyes still on the door as well. "He does not need to," she replied, her tone calm, steady, the words carrying no edge, just truth. Ethan nodded once, absorbing that, understanding that independence in Noah was not distance, it was strength, something that had been built without him and did not depend on his presence to exist. They turned and began walking back, their steps slower now, not bound by time, the city around them moving in its usual patterns, but neither of them rushing to match it. "You built that," Ethan said after a few moments, his voice low, thoughtful. "The way he moves, the way he thinks, the way he understands things." Amara did not immediately respond, her gaze forward, her pace unchanged. "I gave him consistency," she said finally. "He built the rest." Ethan glanced at her, the distinction clear, the humility in her answer matching the reality he had just witnessed. "And what did you not give him?" he asked, not to challenge, not to question, but to understand what space remained, if any. Amara slowed slightly, not stopping, but enough to mark the weight of the question. "Uncertainty," she said. Ethan let that settle, recognizing the significance of what she had chosen not to introduce into Noah's life. And for the first time, he understood that his absence had not been an empty space. It had been a decision she filled deliberately, carefully, with something stable. They reached the building again, the familiar steps leading up to the apartment now carrying a different meaning for Ethan, not as a place he had found, but as a place he was beginning to return to. Inside, the apartment felt quieter without Noah. The small movements and sounds that had filled it earlier replaced by a stillness that made every detail more noticeable. Amara set her bag down, moving through the space with the same calm efficiency, while Ethan remained near the doorway for a moment, adjusting to the shift in atmosphere. "You can sit," she said, gesturing toward the couch, not as an invitation, but as an option. Ethan nodded and moved toward it, sitting down with a posture that was less formal than anything he had ever adopted in his own spaces, his hands resting loosely, not searching for something to hold or control. Amara leaned against the counter again, her gaze on him, not intense, not distant, just present. "You have a company to run," she said, her tone neutral, not accusing, not dismissive, just stating what she knew. Ethan let out a quiet breath, a faint smile touching his expression for a brief second. Not from humor, but from recognition of how different that world felt right now. "It is still there," he said. "It will still be there." Amara tilted her head slightly. "And this?" she asked, her eyes meeting his directly. Ethan did not look away. "This is not something that waits," he replied, the answer coming without hesitation, grounded in a realization that had taken shape the moment he saw Noah. Amara held his gaze for a second longer, then nodded once, a small acknowledgement that did not grant approval, but recognized the shift in priority. "Good," she said quietly. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable, but it was not empty either. It carried the weight of everything unsaid, everything that still needed to be proven through action rather than words. Ethan leaned forward slightly, his forearms resting on his knees, his posture relaxed but attentive. "What does he struggle with?" he asked, the question careful, not assuming weakness, but seeking understanding. Amara's expression softened by a fraction, not in emotion, but in thought. "He does not like change," she said. "Not sudden change. He needs time to understand it, to see where it fits." Ethan nodded slowly, the meaning clear, the implication even clearer. "Then I will not change things suddenly," he said, his voice steady, deliberate. Amara's eyes held his, measuring not the promise, but the awareness behind it. "You already have," she replied, not harsh, not accusing, just factual. Ethan did not defend himself, did not correct her. He let the truth of it settle fully before speaking again. "Then I will make sure the change I brought does not become instability," he said. Amara watched him for a moment, then turned her gaze toward the window, the light filtering in softly, casting a quiet glow across the room. "That is not something you say once," she said. "That is something you repeat until it becomes real." Ethan nodded once, understanding that repetition, consistency, and time were the only ways forward here. "Then I will repeat it," he said quietly. Hours passed differently in that space, slower, more grounded, marked not by meetings or deadlines, but by small, ordinary moments that carried a different kind of significance. Ethan did not check his phone. He did not take calls. He remained present, learning the rhythm of the apartment, the way light moved across the floor, the way silence filled the space without needing to be broken. When it was time to pick Noah up, Amara stood, reaching for her jacket, and Ethan followed without needing to be told. The walk back to the school felt shorter this time, not because of distance, but because Ethan's awareness of each step was sharper, more intentional. They arrived just as the doors opened, children spilling out in small groups, voices rising, laughter mixing with the sound of backpacks and footsteps. Noah emerged a few seconds later, his eyes scanning the crowd until they landed on them, and for the first time, his expression shifted, not dramatically, not with excitement, but with recognition that carried something new, something that acknowledged expectation being met. He walked toward them, his steps steady, his posture relaxed. "You came back," he said again, the words the same, but the meaning deeper now, reinforced by repetition. Ethan met his gaze, his voice calm, grounded. "I said I would," he replied. Noah nodded once, as if confirming a pattern he could begin to trust, then fell into step beside them as they turned to walk home. The three of them moving together in a rhythm that was still forming, still uncertain, but no longer unfamiliar. Each step a quiet continuation of something that was no longer just a possibility, but the beginning of something real. The walk back from school carried a different kind of quiet, not empty, not uncertain, but layered, like each step held something new that had not yet been named, and Ethan noticed it in the smallest details, in the way Noah walked slightly closer than before, not touching, not reaching, but adjusting his path just enough to include him without breaking the space he still needed. The city moved around them as it always did, but for Ethan, the rhythm felt slower, clearer, as if each sound and movement now existed against a different background, one that centered around the small figure beside him rather than the world he used to command. "We stop here," Noah said as they approached the familiar crack in the sidewalk, his voice steady, consistent with the pattern he had already established, and without waiting for confirmation, he crouched again, his eyes focused on the thin line of ants moving in careful formation. Ethan stopped beside him without hesitation, lowering his gaze to follow the same path, watching the movement, the order, the quiet purpose in something so small. "They do not change direction," Noah said, his voice low, almost thoughtful. Ethan nodded slightly. "They know where they are going," he replied. Noah glanced up at him, considering that, then looked back down. "Or they just keep going," he said. The distinction lingered, subtle but present, and Ethan absorbed it without correcting, without adding, understanding that meaning did not always need to be defined to exist. Amara stood a step behind them, her eyes moving between the two, watching not the words, but the way they held space together, the way Ethan did not interrupt, did not lead, did not impose his own pace on Noah's rhythm. After a few seconds, Noah stood again, brushing his hands lightly against his jeans, and continued walking without needing to be told, the pattern intact, unchanged. When they reached the apartment, Noah moved ahead slightly. Unlocking the door with a small key he pulled from his pocket, the action practiced, precise, another piece of independence built into his routine. He stepped inside first, then held the door open just long enough for them to follow, the gesture simple but deliberate, as if he understood that allowing someone in was different from letting them stay. Ethan noticed that, the difference in timing, the quiet control in something so small, and he stepped inside without comment, acknowledging it without needing to speak it. Inside, Noah went straight to his usual spot on the floor, the cars still aligned exactly where he had left them, and he sat down with the same calm focus, picking one up and placing it back into position as if resetting something that had never really been disturbed. Ethan remained standing for a moment, watching, then moved to sit on the edge of the couch, his posture relaxed but attentive, his presence no longer uncertain, but not yet fully settled either. Did anything change? Ethan asked after a moment, his voice directed at Noah, but carrying a quiet awareness of the question itself. Noah shook his head without looking up. No, he said. They stayed the same. Ethan nodded once, the answer aligning with what he had seen, with what he was beginning to understand. Good, he said quietly. Amara moved through the kitchen, setting a kettle on the stove, the soft sound of it clicking into place filling the space briefly before the quiet returned. He notices everything, she said, her voice calm, not directed at Ethan as much as it was placed into the room. Ethan glanced at her, then back at Noah. So do I, he replied. But this time, the words carried less certainty, more awareness of the difference between noticing and understanding. Amara gave a slight nod, acknowledging that distinction without needing to explain it. Noah pushed one of the cars forward again, then paused, his hand hovering over another as if deciding something. You said you would come back, he said, his voice steady, not questioning, but confirming. Ethan leaned forward slightly, his forearms resting on his knees, bringing himself closer without closing the distance completely. I did, he said. Noah looked up at him then, his expression thoughtful, not guarded, not open, just observant. People say things, he said. Sometimes they do. Not do them. The sentence landed quietly, but it carried more weight than its simplicity suggested, and Ethan felt it settle fully before responding. Then I will do them more than I say them. Ethan replied, his tone steady, grounded, not defensive, not persuasive, just clear. Noah held his gaze for a second longer, then gave a small nod, as if placing that statement somewhere in his mind where it could be tested over time. He returned to his cars, the movement smooth, uninterrupted, but something in the space between them had shifted again, not dramatically, not visibly, but enough to be felt. The kettle began to hum softly, the sound building gradually, and Amara poured water into 2 cups, setting one on the counter before bringing the other to the small table near the couch. You should go back to your office, she said, her tone neutral, not dismissing him, but acknowledging the reality of his other world. Ethan glanced at the cup, then back at her. I will, he said. Later. Amara studied him for a moment, not questioning the decision, but measuring the reason behind it. And when you leave? She asked. Ethan leaned back slightly, his gaze steady. I come back, he said. The answer was simple, but it carried the same quiet certainty he had begun to build with each action, each return. Amara nodded once, accepting the structure of that without giving it more weight than it had earned. Then do that, she said. Hours passed in a rhythm that felt different from anything Ethan had known before, marked not by urgency or deadlines, but by presence, by repetition, by small moments that layered into something larger without needing to be announced. Noah eventually stood, stretching slightly, his attention shifting away from the cars. Can we go outside? He asked, his voice directed at Amara, but his eyes flicking briefly toward Ethan. Amara looked at him, then at Ethan, her expression neutral but attentive. Ethan stood slowly, not stepping forward immediately, giving space for the decision to form without pressure. "We can," Amara said finally, her tone calm. Noah nodded, moving toward the door, his steps steady, expectant but not rushed. Ethan followed, matching the pace, the rhythm, the quiet structure that defined everything here. Outside, the light had shifted, the afternoon sun softer, casting long shadows across the sidewalk, and Noah moved toward a small open area near the building where a few other children played, their laughter carrying lightly through the air. He stopped at the edge, watching for a moment before stepping forward, joining without hesitation but without forcing himself into the center. Ethan stood back, observing, his hands relaxed at his sides, his gaze focused not on control, but on understanding, on learning how to exist in a space where he was not the center. Amara stood beside him, her posture calm, her eyes on Noah. "He chooses when to join," she said quietly. Ethan nodded. "And when to leave," he added. Amara glanced at him, a small acknowledgement passing between them, not agreement, not approval, just recognition that he was beginning to see things the way they were, not the way he wanted them to be. They stood there in silence, watching Noah move through the space, not dominating it, not avoiding it, just existing within it with a balance that felt both natural and intentional. And for Ethan, that was the moment something settled deeper than before, not as a realization, but as a quiet shift in understanding that being part of this life was not about entering it, not about claiming it, but about learning how to stand within it without disrupting the patterns that had already made it whole. The late afternoon light stretched across the open space where Noah stood, the golden hue softening the edges of everything it touched, and for a moment, Ethan found himself watching not just Noah, but the way the world seemed to respond to him, the quiet balance in how he moved, how he joined without forcing, how he existed without needing to be seen. A group of children ran past him, their laughter loud and unfiltered, but Noah did not chase them, did not follow their pace. He simply adjusted, stepping into a smaller rhythm that matched his own, picking up a ball that had rolled toward him and holding it for a second, as if deciding what it meant before gently rolling it back. Ethan noticed that the hesitation, not from fear, but from thought, from a need to understand before acting. "He observes first," Ethan said quietly, his voice low enough that it did not carry beyond the space between him and Amara. She nodded once, her eyes still on Noah. "He learns that way," she replied. Ethan shifted his weight slightly, his hands relaxed at his sides, resisting the instinct to step forward, to engage, to shape the moment into something more direct. Instead, he stayed where he was, allowing Noah to define the interaction on his own terms. After a few minutes, Noah stepped back from the group, returning to the edge of the space, his gaze drifting briefly toward Ethan before settling again on the ground in front of him. He crouched, picking up a small stick, tracing a line in the dirt with slow, deliberate movements, creating a pattern that only he seemed to understand. Ethan watched him, the repetition, the focus, the quiet intention behind each movement, and something about it felt familiar again, not because he had done the same thing, but because he recognized the need behind it, the search for order, for something that stayed where it was placed. "He does that when things change," Amara said, her voice soft, not interrupting, just adding context. Ethan glanced at her, then back at Noah. "And things have changed," he said. Amara met his eyes briefly. "Yes," she replied. The word held no judgment, no blame, just acknowledgement of what was already present. Ethan exhaled slowly, his gaze returning to Noah, and for the first time, he felt the full weight of what his presence meant, not as an addition, but as a shift, something that required adjustment, not just from Noah, but from himself as well. "Then I should not make it harder," Ethan said quietly. Amara did not respond immediately, her attention still on Noah, but there was a slight shift in her posture, a recognition of the thought behind the words. "You cannot control how he feels," she said, "but you can control how you show up." Ethan nodded once, the distinction clear, the responsibility settling into place without resistance. Noah stood after a moment, dropping the stick and brushing his hands together, his eyes lifting again toward Ethan, this time holding the look a fraction longer. "Do you play?" Noah asked, the question simple, but carrying something new, not just curiosity, but invitation, small and careful. Ethan did not answer immediately, not because he did not know, but because he understood that the answer mattered beyond the word itself. He stepped forward slowly, closing part of the distance, but not all of it, keeping enough space for Noah to remain comfortable. "I can," Ethan said, his voice steady, not overconfident, not hesitant, just open. Noah tilted his head slightly, considering that, then picked up the ball again, holding it out for a second before tossing it lightly in Ethan's direction. The motion was not forceful, not testing strength, just testing response. Ethan caught it easily, the movement instinctive, but he did not throw it back immediately. He looked at Noah first, reading the distance, the expectation, then rolled it back instead of throwing it, matching the earlier gesture Noah had made with the other children. Noah watched the ball roll toward him, then bent to pick it up, a small shift in his posture signaling something like approval, something subtle but real. He rolled it back again, this time with slightly more force, and Ethan matched it, the exchange building slowly, rhythm over speed, consistency over display. Amara observed from a few feet away, her arms loosely at her sides, her gaze steady, not intervening, not directing, simply allowing the interaction to unfold naturally, her presence a quiet constant in the background. The game, if it could be called that, remained simple, a back and forth that did not require words, did not need structure beyond what they created together, and for Ethan, it was unlike anything he had done before, not because of the action itself, but because of what it required: patience, attention, presence without control. After a few minutes, Noah stopped, holding the ball in both hands, his breathing steady, his eyes lifting to meet Ethan's again. "You did not throw it," Noah said. Ethan shook his head slightly. "You rolled it," he replied. Noah nodded once, as if that answered everything, then turned and walked back toward Amara, handing her the ball before moving past her toward the building. The moment ended as simply as it began, without announcement, without conclusion, just a natural shift back into the rhythm he understood. Ethan watched him go, the small interaction settling into him with more weight than he expected, not because of what they did, but because of what it meant, a step, small but real, into something that could not be rushed. Amara stepped closer then, her gaze moving from Noah to Ethan. "He invited you," she said quietly. Ethan nodded, his expression thoughtful, grounded. "He did," he replied. Amara held his gaze for a moment, then gave a slight nod, a recognition of the moment without overstating it. "That does not happen easily," she added. Ethan understood that immediately, not as a compliment, not as validation, but as information, as something to be respected, not assumed to continue without effort. "Then I will not take it lightly," he said. Amara's eyes softened by a fraction, not visibly, but enough to shift the tone of the space between them. "Do not take anything here lightly," she said. Ethan inclined his head slightly, accepting that fully. They walked back inside together, the transition from the open space to the apartment smooth, familiar now, and Noah returned to his place on the floor without hesitation, the car still aligned, still waiting. Ethan sat again, not as a visitor this time, but as someone beginning to understand where he fit, not fully, not yet, but no longer outside. Noah picked up one of the cars, then paused, his hand hovering for a second before he placed it slightly closer to where Ethan sat, not directly in front of him, not an obvious gesture, but enough to be noticed. Ethan saw it, the small shift, the subtle adjustment, and he did not comment, did not move it further. He simply let it remain where it was, understanding that sometimes the smallest changes carried the most meaning, and that this, more than anything else, was how trust began, not with declarations, but with quiet movements that made space where there had been none before. The small shift of the car closer to him stayed where it was, untouched, but not unnoticed, and Ethan understood that in this space, movement was not always about action. Sometimes it was about restraint, about knowing when to let something exist without changing it. The room carried a quiet rhythm now, one that no longer felt foreign to him, but not yet familiar enough to move through without awareness. Noah adjusted the line of cars again, his fingers precise, his attention fully engaged, but there was a subtle difference in the way he worked, a slight openness in how he positioned one car closer to Ethan's side, not breaking the pattern, but extending it. Ethan leaned forward slightly, his gaze following the alignment, careful not to reach, careful not to interrupt the structure Noah had built. "This one goes here," Noah said, his voice calm, placing another car near the edge of the line, the closest one now within Ethan's reach. Ethan nodded, acknowledging the placement without touching it. "You decided that," he said. Noah glanced up briefly, then back down. "It fits," he replied. The word lingered, simple but precise, and Ethan felt it settled deeper than expected, not just in the context of the cars, but in the space they were beginning to share. From the kitchen, the sound of a spoon lightly tapping against a cup broke the silence for a moment, and Amara stepped into view, her eyes moving between them, observing not the arrangement, but the shift in how they occupied the same space. "He changes things slowly," she said, her voice even, not directed, just present. Ethan nodded once, his eyes still on the cars. "So do I," he replied. But this time, there was less certainty, more intention behind the words. Noah pushed one of the cars forward, then stopped, his hand resting lightly on it, as if deciding something. "Do you work?" he asked suddenly, his tone curious but measured, not intrusive, just direct in the way children often are. Ethan looked at him, the question simple, but carrying a weight that connected two worlds that had not yet fully intersected. "Yes," Ethan said. Noah tilted his head slightly. "Where?" Ethan paused for a fraction of a second, not because he did not have an answer, but because he understood that the way he answered mattered more than the answer itself. "In an office," he said. Noah considered that, his expression thoughtful. "Do you make things?" he asked. Ethan felt a faint shift in his chest, the question reframing everything he had built into something simpler, something more honest. "I help build things," he replied. Noah nodded slowly, as if processing that. "Do they stay?" he asked. The question landed differently, not about business, not about success, but about permanence, about whether what Ethan created had the same stability as the line of cars on the floor. Ethan did not answer immediately. He thought about it, about everything he had built, everything he had moved, everything that had changed under his direction. "Some do," he said finally. Noah looked at him for a second longer, then returned to his cars, the answer accepted, but not fully understood, as if it had been placed somewhere in his mind to be revisited later. Amara watched that exchange quietly, her gaze steady, her expression unchanged, but there was a subtle shift in her posture, a recognition of the way Ethan chose his words, the way he did not overstate, did not simplify beyond truth. "He asks what matters to him," she said. Ethan nodded, understanding that now, that every question Noah asked was not random, it was rooted in his need to understand the world in terms that felt stable, consistent. "Then I will answer what matters," Ethan replied. Amara held his gaze for a moment, then gave a slight nod, acknowledging the intention without reinforcing it. The light in the room shifted as the afternoon moved forward, the shadows lengthening slightly across the floor, touching the edges of the cars, the couch, the table, and Ethan noticed it, the way time passed here not in schedules or meetings, but in light and quiet changes that did not demand attention, but rewarded it. Noah stood after a while, stretching his arms slightly, his attention shifting again. "I am hungry," he said, his voice calm, not complaining, just stating a need. Amara moved immediately, her steps smooth, practiced, moving toward the kitchen without hesitation. Ethan watched, the natural response, the immediate adjustment, something that came from repetition, from knowing exactly what came next without needing to think about it. "Can I help?" Ethan asked, the question careful, not assuming a role, but offering presence. Amara paused for a second, then glanced at him. "You can sit," she said, her tone neutral, not dismissing, but defining the boundary. Ethan nodded, accepting that without resistance, returning to the couch, understanding that stepping in too soon would disrupt more than it would support. Noah moved to the table, climbing onto his chair with a small, practiced motion, his attention already shifting toward what was being prepared. Ethan observed the routine, the predictability, the way everything followed a sequence that made sense without needing explanation. When Amara placed a plate in front of Noah, he did not start eating immediately. He adjusted the position slightly, aligning it with the edge of the table, then began, his movements calm, consistent. Ethan watched, the attention to detail, the need for things to fit, to stay where they belonged, and he recognized it again, not as something he had taught, but as something that existed independently, something he was only now beginning to understand. "Do you eat at your office?" Noah asked between bites, his voice steady, his focus still on his plate. Ethan smiled faintly, the question unexpected but simple. "Sometimes," he said. Noah nodded. "Here, you eat here," he said, not as a suggestion, not as a question, but as a statement that defined how things worked in this space. Ethan glanced at Amara, then back at Noah. "Here, I eat here," he repeated, accepting the structure, the boundary, the quiet rule that had just been set. Amara noticed that, the way he did not push back, did not adjust the statement, and something in her expression shifted slightly, not approval, not acceptance, but acknowledgement of alignment. The meal continued in quiet rhythm, small sounds filling the space, the clink of utensils, the soft movement of chairs, the low hum of the city outside, and for Ethan, it felt different from anything he had experienced before, not because of what was happening, but because of how present he was within it. When Noah finished, he placed his fork down in the same position he had picked it up, precise, intentional, then looked at Ethan again. "You came back 2 times, he said. Ethan nodded. "I did," he replied. Noah held his gaze for a moment, then gave a small nod, as if marking that pattern, recording it somewhere deeper than words. "Then maybe you come back again," Noah said. The words were simple, but they carried something more, not trust yet, but the beginning of it, something forming slowly, carefully, built not on what Ethan said, but on what he had done. Ethan met his gaze, his voice steady, grounded in the same quiet certainty he had been building. "I will come back again," he said. Noah nodded once more, then slid off his chair, returning to his cars without another word, the pattern continuing, the space holding steady, and for Ethan, that was enough, not as an end, but as proof that something small had begun, something that would only grow if he continued to show up exactly as he had, without rushing, without changing the rhythm that had already made this place whole. The rhythm of the room settled again after Noah returned to his cars, but this time it carried something new beneath it, something quieter but stronger, like a pattern, that had been tested and held, not perfectly, but enough to continue. Ethan remained seated, his posture relaxed but attentive, his gaze following Noah's movements without interrupting them, and for the first time, the silence did not feel like something to navigate, it felt like something to respect. The light outside shifted gradually, the late afternoon easing into early evening, the glow softer now, stretching across the floor and catching the edges of the small cars, casting long, thin shadows that moved slowly with time. Ethan noticed it, the way the room changed without anyone directing it, and he understood that this space did not need control to function, it needed consistency. Noah adjusted one of the cars again, then paused, his hand hovering just above it, as if something had caught his attention, something small but important. "This one moved," Noah said quietly, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied the line. Ethan leaned forward a fraction, his gaze following Noah's, noticing the slight misalignment, barely visible unless you were looking for it. "How do you know?" Ethan asked, his voice calm, curious. Noah did not look up. "It is not where it was," he said simply. The answer carried no doubt, no need for explanation, just certainty. Ethan nodded slowly, understanding that in Noah's world, even the smallest change mattered, not because it was big, but because it was different. "Then we fix it," Ethan said. Noah shook his head slightly. "I fix it," he corrected, and gently moved the car back into place, aligning it with the others until the line was exact again. Ethan watched that, the correction, the ownership, and he did not reach, did not offer to help. He simply acknowledged it. "You fixed it," he said. Noah gave a small nod, satisfied, then continued with the pattern, the disruption resolved, the order restored. From the kitchen, Amara moved quietly, cleaning, organizing, resetting the space in her own rhythm, and Ethan noticed the parallel, the way both of them responded to change, not with reaction, but with adjustment, with calm precision. "He needs things to stay where they belong," Amara said, her voice steady, not interrupting, just adding to the understanding. Ethan nodded once. "So do I," he replied, but this time, there was no comparison, no claim, just recognition of a shared need expressed in different ways. Noah looked up again, his gaze moving between them, processing, observing, then returning to his cars without comment, as if the information had been noted and stored. The quiet stretched again, but it felt different now, less like distance, more like space being shared without tension. After a few minutes, Noah stood, his attention shifting again, his energy moving in a way that signaled the next part of his routine. "It is bath time," he said, his voice calm, not asking, just stating what came next. Amara nodded, already moving, already aligned with the sequence. Ethan remained where he was, not stepping in, not offering, understanding that this part of the routine belonged to a space he had not yet earned. Noah walked past him, pausing for a second as he reached the hallway, his eyes lifting to meet Ethan's. "You come back tomorrow?" he asked again, the question familiar now, but carrying more weight with each repetition. Ethan met his gaze, steady, grounded. "Yes," he said. Noah held his eyes for a second longer, then nodded once, turning and disappearing down the hallway, the sound of his footsteps soft, consistent, followed by the quiet closing of a door. The apartment shifted again, the space smaller without Noah's presence in the room, the silence deeper, more focused. Ethan leaned back slightly, exhaling slowly, the day settling into him, not as a series of events, but as a sequence of moments that had required something different from him, something he was still learning how to give. Amara returned a moment later, her hands drying on a towel, her gaze moving to him. "You stayed," she said, her tone neutral, but carrying a subtle acknowledgement. Ethan nodded once. "I said I would," he replied. Amara stepped closer, not into his space, but near enough for the conversation to hold without distance. "You also left everything else behind," she added. Ethan glanced at his phone on the table, untouched, silent. "It will still be there," he said again, but this time, the words carried more certainty, not as an assumption, but as a choice he had already made. Amara studied him for a moment, her eyes searching not for intention, but for consistency. "And when it does not?" she asked. Ethan met her gaze, the question clear, direct. "Then I decide what matters more," he said. The answer did not come with hesitation, and for the first time, it did not feel like something he was saying to convince her. It felt like something he had already decided for himself. Amara held his gaze for a second longer, then nodded once, a small, controlled acknowledgement that did not confirm trust, but did not reject the possibility of it either. The sound of water running faintly from the hallway filled the space, a reminder of the routine continuing, of Noah's world moving forward in its usual pattern, and Ethan listened to it, the steady flow, the quiet consistency, and he understood that this, more than anything, was what he had stepped into, not a moment, not a situation, but a life that moved whether he was part of it or not. "You do not need to come every day," Amara said after a moment, her voice calm, measured. Ethan looked at her, the statement unexpected, not because of what it meant, but because of when she chose to say it. "But I will," he replied. Amara tilted her head slightly. "Why?" she asked, not challenging, not dismissing, just asking for the reason behind the decision. Ethan leaned forward again, his forearms resting on his knees, his posture open, grounded. "Because if I do not, then this becomes something temporary," he said. "And he does not need temporary." The words landed with quiet weight, not dramatic, not forceful, just clear, aligned with everything he had begun to understand. Amara's expression shifted slightly, not visibly, but enough to register, a recognition of the thought behind the answer. "No," she said softly. "He does not." The water in the hallway stopped, the sound fading, replaced by the quiet movements of the routine continuing, and Ethan stood slowly, understanding that his place in this part of the evening had reached its limit for now. "I will come back tomorrow," he said again, not because it needed to be repeated, but because repetition was part of what he was building. Amara nodded once. "Then come back," she replied. Ethan moved toward the door, pausing for a brief second as he reached it, his hand resting lightly on the handle, not opening it immediately. He looked back once, not searching for anything, just acknowledging the space, the quiet, the presence that had begun to form within it. Then he stepped outside, the evening air cooler now, the light fading, the city continuing in its usual rhythm. But for Ethan, It felt different again, not because the world had changed, but because he had, in a way that did not need to be announced, only continued, one return at a time. The night settled over the city in a quiet gradient of dim lights and distant motion, and Ethan sat in his car longer than usual, the engine off, the silence inside the vehicle heavier than anything he had experienced in a boardroom or a deal negotiation, because this silence did not demand decisions, it demanded reflection. The building stood in front of him, unchanged, its windows lit in soft patterns, one of them holding the space he had just left, a space that no longer felt temporary in his mind, but not yet permanent either. He leaned back slightly, his hands resting loosely on the steering wheel, his gaze fixed forward but not focused on anything in particular, replaying the day not in fragments, but in a continuous flow, every moment layered on top of the next, each one building something he could not yet fully define. The sound of his phone vibrating broke through the quiet, sharp, familiar, pulling him back toward the world he had set aside. He glanced at the screen, the name lighting up with urgency that would normally demand immediate response. Marcus. Ethan let it ring once more before answering, his voice steady but quieter than usual. Yes. Marcus did not hesitate. Sir, the board has been trying to reach you for the past 4 hours. There is a situation that requires your approval. Ethan closed his eyes briefly, not in frustration, but in acknowledgement of the shift, the collision of two worlds that could no longer remain separate. What situation? He asked, his tone calm, controlled. Marcus explained quickly, efficiently, outlining numbers, risks, outcomes, the language Ethan knew better than anything else, the language that had defined his life for years. Ethan listened without interrupting, the details clear, the solution already forming in his mind, but something in him did not move toward it the way it used to. Handle it, Ethan said finally. There was a pause on the other end. Sir, Marcus asked, uncertainty breaking through the usual precision. You know what to do, Ethan continued. Execute it. Another pause, shorter this time. Yes, sir, Marcus replied. The call ended, and the silence returned, but it was different. Now, not empty, not heavy, just clear. Ethan opened his eyes, his gaze returning to the building, and for the first time, he understood that stepping away from one world did not mean losing it. It meant choosing how to engage with it differently. He started the car, the engine humming to life, but instead of pulling away immediately, he remained still for a moment longer, his eyes lifting to the window he knew belonged to them, the light still on, steady, unchanged. Tomorrow, he said quietly to himself, the word not a promise anymore, but a continuation. The next morning came earlier than usual, the sky still pale, the city not yet fully awake, and Ethan moved through his own apartment with a different rhythm, slower, more deliberate, not driven by urgency, but by intention. He dressed simply, not in the sharp lines of his usual attire, but in something more neutral, something that did not carry the weight of authority into a space that did not need it. When he arrived at the building, the street was quieter, the air cooler, carrying the faint sound of early traffic in the distance. He walked up the steps, his pace steady, his mind clear, and knocked once, the sound firm but not intrusive. The door opened after a moment, and this time, it was Amara who stood there, her expression unchanged, calm, observant. But there was something else beneath it, something that registered his timing, his consistency. You are early, she said. Ethan nodded once. So is the day, he replied. Amara stepped aside, allowing him in without hesitation, the movement smooth, natural, not an invitation, but no longer a barrier either. Inside, the apartment carried the quiet of morning, the lights softer, filtering through the windows in pale lines that stretched across the floor. Noah sat at the table, his breakfast in front of him, his posture upright, focused, the routine already in motion. He looked up as Ethan entered, his eyes settling on him with a recognition that no longer carried surprise, just expectation. You came back again, Noah said. Ethan met his gaze, his voice steady. I said I would, he replied. Noah nodded once, accepting that, then returned to his breakfast, the pattern continuing without disruption. Ethan moved to the same place on the couch, sitting down with the same measured posture, his presence no longer tentative, but still careful, still aware. Amara poured a cup of coffee, setting it on the table without comment. The gesture simple, not offered, not withheld, just placed. Ethan glanced at it, then at her. "Thank you," he said quietly. She gave a small nod, acknowledging the words without adding to them. The morning moved forward in its usual rhythm, the small sounds of preparation, the quiet movement of routines that did not need explanation, and Ethan followed without stepping ahead, without trying to lead, simply aligning himself with what already existed. When it was time to leave for school, Noah stood, putting on his jacket with practiced ease, his movements precise, consistent. He glanced at Ethan briefly. "We walk," he said. Ethan nodded. "We walk," he repeated. The three of them stepped outside, the air crisp, the light brighter now, the city beginning to wake around them, and they moved together down the sidewalk, their pace steady, their rhythm aligned. At the crack in the sidewalk, Noah stopped again, crouching to observe the ants, the same pattern, the same pause, and Ethan crouched beside him without needing to think about it, his movement now part of the routine, not an interruption of it. "They are still here," Noah said. Ethan nodded. "They stayed," he replied. Noah glanced at him, then back at the ants, as if confirming that statement, then stood, continuing the walk without needing to say anything more. At the school, the routine repeated, the small adjustments, the quiet farewell, the absence of looking back, and Ethan watched it all with a deeper understanding now, not as something he was observing from the outside, but as something he was beginning to stand within. After Noah went inside, Ethan and Amara stood there again, the same space, the same quiet, but it felt different now, less like a pause, more like a continuation. "You are adjusting," Amara said, her voice calm, not questioning, just observing. Ethan looked at her, his expression steady. "I am learning," he replied. She nodded once. "Then keep learning," she said. Ethan inclined his head slightly, accepting that without hesitation. They turned to walk back, the city moving around them, the noise rising, the day beginning, but for Ethan, everything felt grounded in something else now, something that did not shift with the market, did not change with decisions, something that required only one thing from him, the same thing he had already begun to give, showing up, again and again, until it was no longer something he chose, but something he became. The walk back from the school felt quieter than before, not because the city had slowed, but because something inside Ethan had settled into a rhythm that no longer competed with it. And as he walked beside Amara, his steps aligned without thought, without adjustment, as if the pattern had already been learned. The morning air carried a light breeze, brushing against the buildings, moving through the street in soft currents that did not disrupt anything, only touched and passed, and Ethan noticed it in the same way he noticed everything now, not as background, but as part of the moment. Amara walked with the same steady pace, her posture unchanged, her gaze forward, but there was a subtle difference in how she held the silence between them, not guarded, not distant, simply open enough to exist without needing to be filled. "He is beginning to expect you," she said after a few steps, her voice calm, not heavy, but carrying weight beneath its simplicity. Ethan glanced at her, then back ahead, the words settling into him with clarity. "I know," he replied. Amara nodded once. "Expectation is fragile," she continued. "It builds quietly, and it breaks the same way." Ethan absorbed that, the truth in it aligning with everything he had seen in Noah, the careful patterns, the need for consistency, the way small shifts carried larger meaning. "Then I will not break it," Ethan said. Amara did not respond immediately, her eyes scanning the street ahead, the rhythm of her steps unchanged. "You might," she said finally, not harsh, not accusing, just honest. Ethan did not resist that. "Then I will fix it," he replied. Amara glanced at him briefly, her expression steady. "You cannot always fix it," she said. Ethan nodded slowly, accepting that as well, understanding that this was not a system he could control, not a structure he could repair with precision. "Then I will not run from it," he said. The answer came quieter, but it held more weight, more truth, because it acknowledged something deeper than correction. It acknowledged presence through failure, through uncertainty, through whatever came next. Amara's gaze rested on him for a second longer than usual, then she gave a small nod, not approval, not agreement, but recognition. They reached the building, stepping inside with the same measured pace, the familiar space greeting them with its quiet consistency, the the light shifting slightly as the sun climbed higher, illuminating the room in soft, steady layers. Ethan sat in his usual place, not needing direction, not searching for where he belonged, simply returning to where he had been, where he was learning to remain. Amara moved through the apartment, her routine continuing, the small sounds of her actions filling the space without disrupting it, and Ethan watched, not as an outsider, but as someone beginning to understand the sequence, the structure, the rhythm that defined everything here. "You did not go back yesterday," she said after a moment, her voice even, not questioning, but acknowledging something she had observed. Ethan looked at her, then down at his hands briefly before answering. "No," he said. Amara leaned lightly against the counter, her arms relaxed. "That is not sustainable," she said. The statement was not a warning, not a criticism, just a fact placed clearly between them. Ethan nodded once, understanding the truth in it. "I know," he replied, "but it was necessary." Amara studied him, her eyes steady, measuring not the words, but the reasoning behind them. "And today?" she asked. Ethan leaned forward slightly, his forearms resting on his knees, his posture open, grounded. "Today, I balance it," he said. Amara tilted her head slightly. "Balance is not something you say," she replied. Ethan gave a faint nod, acknowledging the pattern in her words, the consistency in how she defined things. "Then I will show it," he said. The silence that followed was not heavy, not tense. It simply held the space for what had been said, for what still needed to be proven. Hours passed in the same quiet rhythm, the apartment holding its steady presence, the light shifting, the sounds of the city filtering in and out without interruption, and Ethan remained, not checking his phone, not stepping away, simply existing within the space in a way that felt more natural with each passing moment. When it was time to pick Noah up again, the movement felt familiar, the walk aligned, the stops understood without needing to be explained, and Ethan followed the pattern with the same attention, the same care, not because he was trying to replicate it, but because he respected it. Noah came out of the school with the same steady steps, his eyes finding them quickly, and this time, there was no pause, no hesitation. He walked directly toward them, his posture relaxed, his expression neutral but settled. "You came back again," Noah said, his voice carrying the same quiet certainty, but now layered with something else, something closer to trust. Ethan nodded. "I did," he replied. Noah looked at him for a moment, then gave a small nod, as if confirming a pattern that was becoming real, then turned and began walking without waiting, assuming they would follow. Ethan and Amara stepped into place beside him, the rhythm continuing, the space between them no longer needing to be measured as carefully, though it still was. At the crack in the sidewalk, Noah stopped again, crouching, his eyes scanning the ants. But this time, he did not count out loud. He simply observed, his presence calmer, more settled. Ethan crouched beside him, not speaking, not needing to, and after a few seconds, Noah looked at him. "They are still here," Noah said. Ethan nodded. "They stayed," he replied. Noah watched them for another moment, then stood, continuing the walk, the pattern intact, but quieter, less rigid, as if something had shifted just enough to allow for variation without breaking the structure. Back at the apartment, Noah moved to his cars again, but instead of aligning them immediately, he paused, looking at Ethan, his hand resting lightly on one of them. "You can move one," Noah said. The words were simple, but they carried a significance that filled the room, not loud, not dramatic, just present. Ethan did not reach immediately. He looked at Noah, then at the line of cars, understanding what was being offered, what was being tested. Slowly, carefully, he reached forward and adjusted one car, not changing its place in the line, just aligning it more precisely, matching the pattern that was already there. He pulled his hand back immediately after, not lingering, not altering anything else. Noah watched closely, his eyes focused, then gave a small nod, approval quiet but clear. "It fits," Noah said. Ethan nodded once, his voice just as quiet. "It fits," he repeated. Amara stood in the background, her gaze steady, her expression unreadable to anyone else. But there was a shift there, something subtle, something that acknowledged not just the action, but the restraint, the understanding behind it. And in that moment, nothing else needed to be said, because the smallest movement had carried more meaning than any conversation could, and the space between them, once defined by absence, was now beginning to hold something else, something built slowly, carefully, one consistent step at a time. The small adjustment of the car remained exactly where Ethan had left it, and for a moment, no one moved, no one spoke. The room holding that quiet shift like something fragile but real, something that did not need to be announced to be understood. Noah looked at the line again, his eyes scanning each car with the same careful attention, and then he nodded once, a subtle confirmation that the pattern had not been broken, only extended. Ethan leaned back slightly, his hands resting loosely on his knees, not reaching again, not adding anything more, because he understood now that one movement was enough, that anything beyond it would not build trust, it would test it. The late afternoon light softened further, casting longer shadows across the floor, stretching the line of cars into something that looked almost continuous, almost infinite, and Ethan noticed how the light did not disrupt the order, it only revealed it differently. "It still works," Noah said quietly, his voice calm, not surprised, just acknowledging what he saw. Ethan nodded once. "It still works," he echoed, his tone steady, aligned with the simplicity of the moment. From the kitchen, Amara stood still for a second longer than usual, her gaze resting on the scene, not intervening, not directing, simply witnessing something she had not expected to happen so soon, or perhaps not at all. She moved then, quietly, returning to her routine, but there was a shift in the way she carried herself, something less guarded, not open, not fully, but no longer closed. The room returned to its rhythm, Noah adjusting the cars again, Ethan observing without stepping in, Amara moving through the space with quiet precision. And for a while, nothing changed, and that in itself was the change. Time passed in the same steady way, the light fading gradually into early evening, the sounds of the city softening outside, and eventually, Noah stood, his attention shifting as it always did when the next part of his routine approached. "It is time," Noah said, his voice calm, not directed at anyone, just stating what came next. Amara nodded, already moving, already aligned with the sequence, and Ethan stood as well, not because he was needed, but because he understood that leaving was part of the rhythm too. Noah paused as he walked past him, his eyes lifting to meet Ethan's, holding the look for a second longer than before. "You will come back?" Noah said, not asking, not testing, just stating something he was beginning to believe. Ethan met his gaze, the weight of that belief settling into him fully, not as pressure, but as responsibility. "I will come back," he said, his voice steady, not louder, not more forceful, just certain. Noah nodded once, satisfied, then continued down the hallway, the sound of his steps fading into the routine that followed. The apartment grew quieter again, the space shifting into evening, and Ethan turned toward the door, but he did not leave immediately. He paused, his hand resting lightly against the back of the couch, his gaze moving across the room, taking in the details he now knew, the alignment of the cars, the position of the table, the way the light settled against the wall. "You did not push," Amara said from behind him, her voice calm, measured. Ethan turned slightly, meeting her gaze. "He did not need me to," he replied. Amara held his eyes for a moment, then nodded once. "No," she said softly. "He did not." The silence that followed was not empty. It carried something else now, something that had been building quietly over time, something that did not need to be named to exist. Ethan moved toward the door, his steps measured, his movements aligned with the same rhythm he had been learning since the moment he stepped into this space. He reached for the handle, then paused again, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness. "I will be here in the morning," he said, not because it needed to be said, but because consistency had become something he chose to reinforce, not assume. Amara nodded once, her expression steady. "Then we will be here," she replied. The words were simple, but they carried something more, not a promise, not an invitation, but a recognition that this space was no longer something he entered and left without impact. It was something he returned to, something that now included him in a way that was still forming, still undefined, but real. Ethan stepped outside, the evening air cooler, the light fading into the first hints of night, and for a moment he stood there, not moving, not rushing back into the world he had once prioritized above everything else. The city continued around him, unchanged, but he did not feel pulled by it in the same way anymore. He got into his car, started the engine, and drove away, but the direction felt different now, not away from something, but toward a balance he had not known how to find before. The next morning came with a quiet certainty, the sky just beginning to lighten, the city still half asleep, and Ethan moved through his routine with the same deliberate pace he had begun to carry into everything. When he arrived at the building, the steps felt familiar, not just in memory, but in meaning, and he walked up to the door and knocked once, steady, clear. The door opened almost immediately, and Noah stood there, his small hand on the handle, his eyes lifting to meet Ethan's with something that had shifted fully now, something that no longer held uncertainty. "You came back," Noah said. Ethan nodded once. "I said I would," he replied. Noah stepped aside without hesitation, allowing him in, the movement natural, unforced, and as Ethan stepped inside, he noticed it immediately, not just the action, but the absence of doubt behind it. The room looked the same, the cars still aligned, the light just beginning to fill the space, but something in it felt different, something that had changed quietly, without disruption, something that had grown in the space between repeated actions and consistent presence. Noah walked back to the floor, sitting down with the same calm focus, but this time, he did not keep the entire line to himself. He moved one car slightly closer to Ethan again, then another, expanding the pattern just enough to include him more clearly, not fully, not entirely, but more than before. Ethan saw it, understood it, and instead of reaching immediately, he sat down beside him, not too close, not too far, matching the space Noah had created. He did not move any of the cars right away. He simply sat there, present, aligned, allowing the moment to exist exactly as it was. And, for the first time, nothing in him felt the need to change it, because what had been built here was not something that required control, it required continuity. And as he sat there, in the quiet, in the light that now filled the room, he understood that this was no longer about proving something. It was about becoming something, someone who showed up, someone who stayed, someone who did not move what did not need to be moved. And in that understanding, the space between them, once defined by absence, was now held together by something stronger, something steady, something that would not need to be spoken to be known.